no comparison. Isiah Thomas could take over a game both scoring-wise as well as controlling the game as a point guard. There's never been a guard that can do what Isiah could do in terms of just whether he could take over the game in the fourth quarter and win you the game. John Stockton didn't have those type of ability. His ability was more controlling the game, running that incredible pick and roll game with Karl Malone. Also, John was tough. He was a great defensive player, but he didn't have what Isiah had in terms of you could throw the ball to Isiah over in the corner and say, go one-on-one, and he's going to get you a basket. I saw that personally.
There is one name in basketball history that still makes people argue, still makes people uncomfortable, and still makes people question everything they thought they knew about greatness. That name is Isiah Thomas. Not many players in the history of the NBA have been loved and hated at the same time. Not many players have won championships and still been treated like they did something wrong. And when Magic Johnson sat down alongside Dennis Rodman and started talking about the real story behind Isiah Thomas, what came out was something the basketball world needed to hear for a very long time. This was not a casual conversation. This was two legends finally breaking their silence about the most misunderstood player the game has ever produced. Magic Johnson started by saying something very simple but very powerful. He said Isiah Thomas played every single game with a chip on his shoulder. And that chip was not just about basketball. It was about respect. It was about proving to the world that a kid from the west side of Chicago who grew up in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the country could stand on the same floor as the biggest names in sports and not just survive, but dominate. Magic said that when Isiah walked onto the court, he carried the weight of everyone who told him he was not big enough, not strong enough, and not important enough. And instead of letting that weight crush him, Isiah turned it into fuel. Every game was personal. Every game was a statement. Magic had seen many great competitors in his life, but he said Isiah's desire to prove people wrong was on a completely different level. Dennis Rodman jumped in and added something that many people forget about Isiah. He said Isiah was not just a competitor. He was someone who actually thrived in chaos. While most players would fall apart under extreme pressure, Isiah became sharper. The louder the crowd got, the more hostile the environment became, the better Isiah played. Dennis said that this was not something you could teach. This was something that came from deep inside. Isiah had been fighting his whole life, fighting to be seen, fighting to be heard, fighting to be respected. And by the time he got to the NBA, those instincts were already hardwired into him. That is what made him so dangerous. You could not rattle him because he had already been through worse than anything the basketball court could offer. Magic then went back to the beginning and talked about the early days of their friendship. When Magic Johnson and Isiah Thomas first came into the NBA, they were not rivals, they were brothers. They hung out together in the off-season, they talked on the phone constantly, and they genuinely cared about each other. Magic said those years were some of the best of his life because he had someone in the league who understood what it felt like to carry an entire franchise on your back. They shared that burden together. Even the 1988 NBA Finals between the Lakers and the Pistons was one of the most intense series in NBA history. The Pistons felt they were robbed of a championship that year. There was a controversial foul call in Game 6 that many people believe cost Detroit the title. Isiah had scored 25 points in the third quarter of that game on a badly injured ankle, one of the greatest performances in finals history, and yet the Pistons still lost. That heartbreak planted a seed of bitterness. When the two teams met again in the 1989 finals, the Pistons swept the Lakers. The friendship between Magic and Isiah was already cracking, and competition was pulling them apart. Magic explained that Isiah began to feel like the league favored certain players and certain teams. He felt that the NBA wanted the Lakers and the Celtics to be the faces of the league, and that Detroit was treated like an unwanted guest at the table. That belief was not entirely without reason. The Pistons were never marketed the way the Lakers or Celtics were. They were called the Bad Boys, a nickname that was meant as an insult, but that they embraced as an identity. Isiah led that identity without apology. He did not care if the league wanted him to smile more or be more friendly to the media. He was going to play his way, win his way, and represent Detroit his way. And if the rest of the world had a problem with it, that was their issue, not his. Dennis Rodman confirmed this and added even more depth to the story. He said Detroit embraced the villain role fully because they had no other choice. The league was never going to make them the heroes. The media was never going to write feel-good stories about the Pistons. So instead of trying to change who they were, they leaned into it. They became the team that everybody feared and nobody wanted to face. And Isiah was the leader of all of it. Dennis said Isiah did not just allow the villain role, he owned it, he shaped it, he made it powerful. And that is what made the Pistons different from every other team in history. They were not trying to be liked. They were trying to be feared, and it worked. Now let us talk about the basketball itself, because this is where Isiah Thomas does not get enough credit. Magic Johnson said something that should be talked about more often. He said Isiah's basketball IQ was one of the highest the game has ever seen. Isiah did not dominate with size. He was 6'1". He did not overpower people with athleticism. He was quick, yes, but he was not a freak athlete in the traditional sense. What Isiah had was a mind that was 2 or 3 plays ahead of everyone else on the court. He saw angles before they opened. He knew where every defender was going to be before they got there. He exploited weaknesses so quickly that by the time the other team figured out what happened, the damage was already done. Dennis Rodman added that Isiah ran offenses with precision and fearlessness. He controlled games not by being... He manipulated tempo better than anyone Dennis had ever seen. He could slow the game down to a crawl if that was what Detroit needed, or he could push the pace and create chaos in the blink of an eye. That control frustrated even the best defenders in the league. Magic said this mental edge is what made Detroit champions. The Pistons won back-to-back titles in 1989 and 1990. They beat the Lakers. They beat the Bulls. They beat every team that stood in their way. And they did it not because they had the most talent, although they had plenty of talent, but because they had the most will. And that will started with Isiah. He was the heartbeat of that team. Dennis looked at Magic and said something that everyone who watched those teams already knew. Without Isiah Thomas, the Pistons were just bodies. Championships followed his voice. He was the one who made everything work. He was the one who turned a group of tough individuals into a championship machine. But of course, no conversation about Isiah Thomas can avoid the controversy with Michael Jordan. This is where Isiah's legacy became complicated in the eyes of the public, and Magic and Dennis both had a lot to say about it. Magic explained that the Pistons' physical style of play against Jordan crossed emotional lines. Even if everything they did was within the rules of that era, the way they targeted Jordan felt personal. And Dennis Rodman admitted something that not many people in that locker room have ever said out loud. He said the goal was not just to stop Michael Jordan. The goal was to break him mentally. They wanted to get inside his head. They wanted to make him doubt himself. They wanted to make him feel like every time he stepped onto the floor against Detroit, he was walking into a war zone. And Isiah Thomas was the one who set the tone for all of it. He believed intimidation was a legitimate part of winning. He believed that if you could make your opponent fear you before the game even started, you had already won half the battle. That belief made Isiah enemies. It made headlines. It made the entire basketball world look at Detroit with disgust. But it also made championships. And that is the part people do not want to admit. The Pistons' methods worked. They were not just bullies. They were brilliant. Their defensive schemes, their physicality, their mental warfare, all of it combined to create one of the most dominant stretches in NBA history. But because they did not do it the pretty way, because they did not do it the way the league wanted, they were punished in the court of public opinion. And then came the moment that changed everything, the infamous walk-off. In 1991, the Chicago Bulls finally broke through and swept the Detroit Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals. As the final seconds ticked away, the Pistons got up from the bench and walked off the court without shaking hands with the Bulls. Isiah Thomas led that walk-off, and from that moment on, public perception of him was forever changed.
Magic said that one moment erased years of greatness in the eyes of many fans. It did not matter that Isiah had won 2 championships. It did not matter that he was one of the most skilled players in NBA history. That walk-off became the defining image of his career for millions of people. Dennis agreed and said Isiah was judged more harshly than anyone else in the league. Other teams had done similar things before and after, but because it was the Pistons, because it was against Jordan, because it was Isiah, it became unforgivable. Isiah himself never apologized for it, because he believed respect was not something that was owed, it was something that was earned. And in his mind, the Bulls had not earned it yet, at least not in the way he defined respect. This brings us to what Magic Johnson called the most painful chapter of Isiah Thomas's career, the 1992 Dream Team. When the United States assembled the greatest basketball team ever put together for the Barcelona Olympics, Isiah Thomas was not on the roster. He was a 2-time champion.
He was a Finals MVP. He was a 12-time All-Star. By every measure of basketball achievement, he deserved to be on that team, but he was left off. Magic admitted that politics played a role. Dennis was even more direct. He said Isiah paid the price for standing his ground against Michael Jordan and against the league's carefully crafted image. The talent was never the issue. Everyone knew Isiah was good enough. The issue was relationships. The issue was that Isiah had made powerful enemies by refusing to play the game off the court. He would not soften himself. He would not pretend to like people he did not like. He would not smile for the cameras and say the right things. And that independence cost him one of the greatest honors in basketball history. That decision haunted his legacy for decades. Dennis remembered how Isiah reacted to being left off the Dream Team. He did not throw a public tantrum. He did not go on television and badmouth the selection committee. He absorbed the pain privately and kept moving forward. But anyone who knew him could see the wound. It was deep, and it never fully healed. Magic said that hurt followed Isiah for the rest of his career and beyond. It was a reminder that in the NBA, being great was not always enough. You also had to be liked by the right people, and Isiah Thomas was never willing to trade his authenticity for popularity. But here is the thing that both Magic and Dennis agreed on. Isiah Thomas never let that pain destroy him. Instead, he leaned into it. He embraced being the outsider. He embraced being the villain. He did not try to change the narrative. He did not go on an apology tour. He stayed true to who he was and let his record speak for itself. Dennis said that confidence scared people. Isiah never softened himself for approval. He stayed authentic to Detroit's identity until the very end. And Magic said that kind of strength, that kind of refusal to bend, is something you almost never see in professional sports. Most athletes eventually give in to the pressure. Most athletes eventually say what people want to hear. Isiah never did. And whether you love him or hate him for it, you have to respect it. Magic then talked about something that often gets lost in all the controversy. He talked about Isiah's leadership and what it actually looked like behind closed doors. Dennis explained how Isiah demanded loyalty from his teammates above all else. He protected his players fiercely. If someone on the team was struggling, Isiah would take the blame publicly so that his teammates would not have to deal with the pressure. He would stand in front of cameras after tough losses and own everything. He never pointed fingers. He never threw anyone under the bus. And that kind of leadership built a level of trust inside the locker room that is very rare. Magic said that sacrifice is rarely talked about when people discuss Isiah Thomas. Leaders absorb pressure so others can perform, and Isiah did that constantly throughout his career. Dennis also talked about how Isiah demanded accountability in practice. There were no days off. No one was allowed to coast. If you did not bring your best effort every single day, Isiah would let you know about it. But he did it by leading through example, not by yelling or screaming. Magic confirmed this. He said Isiah did not need speeches to control the room. His intensity did the talking. When you walked into the gym and saw Isiah already working, already sweating, already preparing for war, you had no choice but to match his energy. That is how championship cultures are built, not through words, through actions. And Isiah's actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. Magic reflected on something that shows just how tough Isiah Thomas truly was. He talked about how Isiah played through injuries that would have sidelined most players. Ankles, wrists, bruises, cuts. It did not matter. If Isiah could walk, he was playing. And not just playing, but playing at an elite level. The most famous example is Game 6 of the 1988 Finals, when he scored 25 points in the third quarter on a badly sprained ankle. He could barely stand. He was in obvious pain with every step, and yet he put on one of the greatest single-quarter performances in NBA Finals history. Magic said that toughness earned deep respect inside the league, even from people who did not like Isiah personally. You could question his attitude, but you could never question his heart. Dennis explained that Isiah played through those injuries not because he wanted to prove something to the public, but because he could not bear the thought of letting his teammates down. That is what drove him. Not ego, not records, not highlight reels. His team, his city, his people. Detroit versus everybody was not just a slogan, it was personal. That loyalty bonded the Pistons tighter than any other team in the league. They were not just teammates, they were brothers, and Isiah was the big brother who would do anything to protect the family. Magic then shifted the conversation to what happened after Isiah's playing career ended. He said the same intensity that made Isiah great on the court followed him off the court as well. Isiah did not soften his opinions when he became a broadcaster or a coach or an executive. He said what he believed, and he did not care if it made people uncomfortable. Dennis added that controversy followed Isiah off the court just like it followed him on the court. But that was not because Isiah was seeking attention, it was because he was being honest. And honesty, especially the kind that challenges power structures, always makes people uncomfortable. Dennis remembered how Isiah embraced mentorship later in his career. He shared his knowledge with younger players without ego. He did not hold back information to protect his own legacy. He genuinely wanted the game to evolve. Magic said that even Isiah's biggest critics benefited from his insight because he understood basketball at a level that very few people ever reach. He loved the game deeply, and that love showed in everything he did, even when the public did not want to see it. Magic reflected on how history has slowly started to reevaluate Isiah Thomas. Time reveals complexity. The more distance we get from those heated moments, the more we can see the full picture. Dennis said that narratives fade, but impact remains. Championships do not lie. Banners do not lie. And Isiah Thomas's fingerprints are permanently stamped on the history of the NBA. He forced the league to evolve. He showed that intelligence, grit, and leadership could beat raw star power. He proved that you did not have to be the biggest or the fastest to be the best. You just had to be the toughest. You just had to be the smartest. You just had to be willing to pay the price that greatness demands. Dennis looked at Magic and said something that perfectly captures who Isiah Thomas was and still is. He said Isiah Thomas was never afraid of conflict. Magic nodded and added that greatness often comes with controversy. Isiah was not perfect, nobody is, but he was real. He was authentic in a world that constantly pressured him to be something else. He chose truth over comfort. He chose winning over popularity. He chose his team over his image. And those choices cost him. They cost him the dream team. They cost him public affection. They cost him the kind of universal love that other stars of his era enjoyed. But those same choices also gave him something that can never be taken away. 2 championship rings, a legacy that still sparks debate 35 years later, and the deep, lasting respect of anyone who truly understands what it takes to lead, to compete, and to win at the highest level. Magic concluded the conversation with a thought that stayed with both him and Dennis long after the cameras stopped rolling. He said history needs context. Isiah Thomas was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was both. And maybe that is what makes him so fascinating. He was a complicated man in a world that wanted simple stories. He refused to fit into the box that the media and the league built for him. He broke out of it every single time. And in doing so, he changed the game forever. Dennis nodded and gave the final word. He said greatness is rarely clean.
Isiah Thomas's legacy lives in tension between love and hate, between respect and resentment, between championships and controversy. And that tension, that constant push and pull between who people wanted him to be and who he truly was, is exactly what made him unforgettable. Love him or hate him, you cannot tell the story of the NBA without Isiah Thomas. He left scars and banners behind. And that is not controversy. That is impact. That is legacy. That is the dark truth that Magic Johnson and Dennis Rodman finally decided the world needed to hear.